another installment of our discussion of archaeology in the Bible. In this session, what I want us to do is to look at three cities in the New Testament world that Paul goes to preach, and to look at sort of the respective character of the three towns and to consider sort of how each of them responds to the message of the gospel. We're going to be looking at Athens and Corinth and Ephesus. And the character of all these towns is very, very different. We have to realize that in our world, even today, towns have their reputations. If you think in terms of Detroit, most of us think in terms of building automobiles, even though that may not be the most common thing that goes on there. Hollywood, movie making. Memphis, Music City. I mean, towns have their reputations. And so it was in the ancient world as well. And this is part of what's going to play into how the narrative unfolds. So we're looking at the Great Commission, going into all the world, where Jesus tells the disciples to take the message to all nations. And we're going to look at the socio-cultural survey of these three cities and what goes on in each of them respectively. The first one that we consider is the city of Athens. Athens is sort of the intellectual center of the ancient world. Now, there were other towns that were on an equal footing intellectually with it, but Athens was sort of the one that had the heritage. It would be considered, if it were in the United States, one of those Ivy League schools. Athens is situated on the southern coast or near the southern coast of Greece, and Paul goes there waiting for his friends to arrive from further north in Greece. And while he's there, he's going to take advantage of the opportunity to preach the gospel. After all, that's the mission that the Lord has given him. Go and teach the gospel to all people. And Paul will, in his inevitable way, place himself in strategic locations to sort of increase the exposure that he has to the people. So he goes into the marketplace. And as we look at this photograph, we're looking from the Acropolis of Athens. We'll look at that in a moment. We're looking from the Acropolis, and the green area that you see in the middle part of the photograph is basically the marketplace, the political marketplace, political and civic marketplace of ancient Athens. And it may well be in this location that Paul spends most of his time. Now, a lot of scholars will argue there's another marketplace, the commercial one nearby, but twiddly-dee, twiddly-dum. I mean, he's there, and wherever it is that he needs to preach and teach, he goes there. And it's easy to envision, if you visit here, Paul wandering around in this location. Now, one of the things he's going to observe, of course, is that they are very religious, and he's going to allude to the places of their worship. And what we're going to look at briefly in this discussion is some of these locations. As we consider Paul going down into that marketplace, into the Agora, looking back up to the Acropolis. The word Acropolis is a Greek word which means high city. And the high area is that Acropolis. It was surmounted by some temples, a religious location, designed in part to be an area where people could retreat in time of warfare. It was a fortification in a very real sense of the term. And there are fortification systems that are up there. But this would be a very similar view to what Paul would have seen when he was down in the marketplace, sort of surrounding and looking around at the various sites that he could see. And again, in his reference, in his defense, he talks about, as he wandered through the city, he sees that they are very religious, and he sees all kinds of altars, and even an altar to an unknown God that he's going to use as the springboard by which to tell them about Jesus and the resurrection. One of the places that's mentioned, actually not specifically mentioned, but there is a reference to Paul encountering the Epicureans and the Stoics. This is a reconstruction of the Stoa of Attalus. Attalus sponsored the building of this in the 2nd century BC. So this is built along the lines and the construction and the footings and everything else of the original Stoa that was there. And it's easy to envision Paul going into this location and talking with the philosophers, discussing with them about Jesus and the resurrection. And of course, he finally precipitates their interest where they're going to take him to explain, take him to the Areopagus to explain this new religion about which you're speaking. But as you visit the area today, it's very easy to envision this kind of scene where Paul is wandering around talking to the various people. Again, he refers to various places of worship. This is the platform of the altar of Zeus that would have been seen with its appropriate superstructure in the time of Paul. Or another one that he would have seen that still exists is the temple to Hephaestus, the god of fire and foundry work. most exquisite, beautiful little temple, fully preserved, that still stands there. Here's another view of it, and it's a delight to look at. It's so quaint, and it's just all there. Very impressive. Some people get very upset as they look at the columns because some of the drums in the columns are out of alignment, and they say, oh, isn't it about to fall down? It stood for 2,500 years. I don't think we need to be overly concerned about it, although, you know, it could fall down still with an earthquake. I understand that, but 2,500 years is a pretty good time for it to stand. And you can still see it today. But again, Paul would have seen this, a temple dedicated to one of the gods of the Greco-Roman world. On the other side of the Acropolis is this huge remnant of the temple to Zeus. It actually was begun several centuries before Paul, but in the 2nd century before Paul, they started replacing the earlier columns with these Corinthian columns. And it wasn't until the 2nd century AD that they finally finished this. So Paul would have seen this kind of refurbishment, if you will, that was involved in this temple to Zeus. And again, an indication of this prevalent idea of worshiping all kinds of gods. But as Paul might make his way up to the Acropolis, he would pass through what is known as the Propylaea. All this vegetation, there's a path that goes through this, and you go through the formalized entrance into the Acropolis, and as you climb up the access there, off to your right is this beautiful, exquisite little temple to Athena Nike, the great tennis shoe goddess of antiquity. Well, actually, no. But Nike has taken their name from Nike, Athena Nike, the goddess of victory, and they've appropriated that image to the commercialization of sports shoes. But she was a goddess very much respected in the ancient world. Now, this little temple housed a statue in antiquity of Athena, who often is portrayed with wings. The Athena Nike is the goddess of victory, flying goddess. But her wings were gone. And a lot of debate goes on as to why were her wings gone. Well, modern scholars will often say, well, the wings were taken off because she was too big to stick into the temple, and so they take her wings off and stuck her in there. That's rather mundane. Pausanias, interestingly, who is a tour guide, wrote a series of tour guide books, if you will, in the 2nd century AD, talks about the temple Nike, and he says that whenever they put her in there, they clipped her wings so that she would not fly away. Obviously a much more colorful and dramatic kind of description, and again sort of plays into the mindset of the people of the city. And again, Paul then is encountering this, and he's trying to expose them to something that really is fundamentally much more meaningful. As he continues into the Acropolis, again, should he have gone up to the Acropolis, off to the left, as he passes through that entryway, there would be this beautiful, again, exquisite building known as the Erechtheum. This is actually a temple that's dedicated both to Poseidon as well as to Athena. Now, the Porch of the Maidens, which is actually on the right-hand side, which is one of those images that always appears in art history books, actually is not part of the temples per se. This is actually a cenotaph tomb in honor of someone that had died in antiquity. But, I mean, very, very ancient antiquity. But the rest of the structure, the central part is dedicated to Athena, and the porch on the left-hand side is dedicated to Jupiter, in honor of the dispute that Athena and Jupiter had as to who was going to be the head god or goddess of this town. And the contest ensues, and finally Athena wins by vote, by the way, and she is then given the honor of the matron deity of the city. But the Athenians weren't stupid. They didn't want to tick off Poseidon, so they have a temple dedicated to him too. You don't want the god of the sea opposed to you, especially if you get your livelihood by sailing a lot. So they recognize the wisdom of that. But the major structure that is on the top of the Acropolis is the Parthenon. The Parthenon, that is a temple dedicated to the goddess Athena, and it housed a representation of this deity, the goddess Athena. There's a very good portrayal of this in the city of Nashville, Tennessee, in Centennial Park. If you ever have a chance to visit there, go there, and they have a full-size representation of the goddess and gold regalia and everything, and it's quite impressive. Now, this actually is a 2nd century representation of Athena, 2nd century AD, and we're assuming that it's very similar to what the statue was in the Parthenon. But Athena was the matron deity of the city. But obviously, we look at Zeus, we look at Jupiter. Jupiter and Zeus are similar, but and then we have Hephaestus and a host of other deities that could be noted. And eventually, though, they're going to have the altar to the unknown God. And again, Paul uses that as the springboard to talk to them about the Lord who created the heavens and the earth and everything in it, and in whom we live and move and have our being. This raises their curiosity, and they eventually are going to take Paul to the Areopagus. Now, the photograph that we're looking at, on the far left-hand side of the picture, the bare rock mass is the Areopagus. Actually, there are two Areopaguses. One is the one that originally was there, and this is the one we're looking at. And there was another one to which the Areopagite Council was eventually moved. But we don't know exactly which of these Paul had to go to in order to give his defense. But the other one is on the other side of the Agora area. But we'll go on the basis of this one, and we're going to climb the rock. This is one of the great joys that everybody who visits Athens gets to do. These rocks, these steps are extremely slippery. And now they've made another little way to get up that is much more safe. But when I first started going here in the 70s, there was no other access, and you went up these, and it's slick as glass, and as scary as it can be trying to get down. But everybody, got to go up there. Got to go up there where Paul talks to the Athenian philosophers. So we're going to go up there, and here I am, preaching with the Acropolis in the background. And it's very easy to envision Paul as he's talking about the God who made the universe and heaven and earth and everything in it, sort of in a sweeping say, doesn't dwell in temples made with men's hands, and almost sweeping his hand on the horizon. Because all over the place they're talking about gods and deities that they rely upon. And the God in heaven doesn't rely on these temples, but instead it's in Him that we live and move and have our being. He doesn't depend on us. We depend on Him. And this is the point that Paul is emphasizing. He eventually, of course, gets to the point of the resurrection and Jesus and the resurrection and the judgment to come. And at that point, as so many people are inclined to do, they turn a deaf ear and they don't want to hear any more about it. And the Bible indicates that he didn't seem to have a whole lot of success there. So he leaves this intellectual center and goes to Corinth. Corinth is another ballgame. Totally. Corinth is sort of on the other side of the peninsula that is there. And as we pass over this, I have an aerial view of this isthmus that joins the Peloponnese with the mainland of Greece. And this little isthmus is vital in the ancient world because the people quickly learned that you could actually expedite shipping if you would come and stop on one side, unload your boat, and take it across the other side, even the boat sometimes, take it across the other side and reload the goods, and even the boat sometimes, and relaunch on the other side. Now, the reason for this was the currents and hazards of sailing around the Peloponnese was extremely dangerous. And so it was much more expeditious and much more profitable to go through all of that additional work to get across this isthmus and sail on whichever direction you're going. Now, having said that, Corinth develops a reputation. The reputation is not the intellectual center that Athens was. The reputation of Corinth is sort of like Las Vegas. All right, it's sort of the Vegas of the ancient world. If you want to go somewhere to get lost in sin, this is the place to go. It's interesting, even in Greek, the word Korinthiazomai, do you hear the word? Corinth? Korinthiazomai means to commit fornication. Now, it's pretty pathetic when the name of a town becomes synonymous with an activity like that. But that's what Corinth eventually became known as. Now, imagine, and I think part of what we have to understand is the sailors coming along, they've been at sea for who knows how long, and party time, and they're going to go to the big city here and lose it, however you want to define lose it here, all right? And this is part of the difficulty that Paul is going to be encountering as he establishes a church here. Now, I mentioned that shipping the goods from one side to another, that was over what is known as the Diolkos. And a number of years ago, the archaeologists uncovered part of that Diolkos. And here, this paved flagstone pavement that we're looking at is the Diolkos from the ancient world, with ruts even still in it, where the wagons would be carrying the goods and wearing down the stones and so forth. Here I am standing in section where part of it's fallen down into part of the ocean where it would rise and drop a little bit. But you see how thick these stones are. And part of this still exists. And this would be the traffic area that the people in antiquity would be using, going across the isthmus from one bay to the other bay and so forth. But in the meantime, they're going to go into Corinth to party. The main town coming in from the north, and that big hill in the background is the Acra Corinthus. It's the Acropolis of Corinth. much, much higher than the Acropolis at Athens. But on top of it is the remnant of this temple, apparently dedicated to Aphrodite. Now, there's a lot of argument that goes on the academic world as to what the connections are. One early source talks about there are 1,000 temple priestesses associated with this temple to Aphrodite who would peddle their wares. They were temple prostitutes. And a lot of scholars say, well, that can't be the case because this temple's not big enough to accommodate 1,000 temple priestesses. I think it's fundamentally missed the point. I don't think necessarily the temple was the precinct within which the activity occurred, but that the priestesses or whoever they were would be, soliciting down in town and paying tribute and taxes to the temple. Now, some will argue that all of that's just hyperbole and didn't exist, but it's interesting that Paul, in the letters to the Corinthians, talks about the problem of harlotry more pronouncedly than he does in other books. And he talks about how a Christian should not engage in this kind of activity, and to do so sins against one's own body. We've been bought with a price. We must glorify God in our bodies. Now, Paul speaks very bluntly to Corinth, and I can't help but think that reputation, I'm not suggesting everybody in Corinth was engaged in these kinds of activities, but that reputation still has attraction to a lot of people, and Paul, in part, is responding to that. Down in the city of Corinth, Paul would have seen this temple to Apollo, dating from the 6th century BC. We assume it's to Apollo. There's nothing intrinsic within the construction that gives us that indication, but it's certainly a reasonable attribution given the historical sources and so forth. But these are single stone columns. They're not built in drums like is customary that we saw at the Parthenon and so forth. But Paul would have seen this, would have been fully aware of this, and around this temple to Apollo there are the agora, the marketplace. Now, the Bible tells us that Paul will associate himself with Priscilla and Aquila, who've come to Corinth because they've been expelled from Rome, but he associates with them because they're tent makers. It's easy to imagine this curved structure in the foreground is one of these shops. Now, what kind of shop, I don't know, but I want you to get the image of, and envision, if you will, Paul standing in front of that and people coming down, and he asks them, okay, you need a new tent? Well, no. Well, have you thought about your tent in eternity? And sort of breaking into some evangelistic discussion. What about a more permanent structure in the afterlife? Not just a tabernacle to wander around here. I can easily envision Paul transitioning into something and making it more spiritual. And the Bible indicates he had quite a bit of success. Even though there was persecution against him, he had quite a bit of success in the city of Corinth. Another structure at Corinth that's interesting is the Asclepion. Most tourists don't go here, but I made it a point several years ago to break away from the group and go down there. And in the excavation at the Asclepion, which is basically a hospital, all right, Asclepius was the Greek god of healing. And a lot of the things that the people who were healed would do is when they're healed, and they would bring offerings to Asclepius and in appreciation for what they perceived him as healing. And you can visit the museum. They've changed this a bit, but here are different body parts, clay body parts that they've given in dedication to Asclepius for the appreciation of the healing of the part that has been sick. You look at this and you think, oh, that's interesting. You got all these independent body parts hanging on the wall. And I can't help but think, again, remembering Paul's Corinthian correspondence, in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, remember where he talks about, the eye can't say to the foot. And you have all these independent body parts that Paul says, this is just ludicrous. We aren't all an eye, or we aren't all an ear. We are parts of a body that work together and are joined to the head. And you almost look at this and think, maybe Paul is using the reality of this existence in Corinth as the basis for this imagery that he uses to talk about the unification and unity of the body of Christ. We need to work together rather than hanging independently on a wall like this. Sadly, a lot of people today do that. Anyway, we do know that there was a Jewish community here, not only because of the Bible, certainly that's a significant attestation, but we know from some archaeological discoveries. The lintel at the top reads in part Synagogue of the Hebrews. It's reconstructed in part, but then you'll also notice the menorah portrayal. We don't know exactly where the synagogue was, but certainly Paul's association with the synagogue became a bone of contention, a point of contention in Corinth. And Paul then is taken before the judgment seat, the bema, as it is referred to at Corinth. Here is the platform of that judgment tribunal, the superstructure of which is missing, and Paul likely would have stood there at the base of this, giving his defense to Gallio, And Gallio doesn't want anything to do with this. This is just your all's interpretation of religion. Get out of here, leave me alone. Doesn't threaten the government. And so it doesn't go anywhere. Paul remains ultimately in the city of Corinth for 18 months or so with quite a successful ministry, to the point that he has at least 2 letters that he writes to them. It's sort of a messed up congregation, but nonetheless, he is attempting, and he sees in them, the Lord sees in them, the potential for full redemption and growth and maturity in Christ. And that's a critical point. In that immoral town, Paul stays for quite a lengthy period of time, with apparently a sizable congregation of God's people being established. Eventually then he goes to Ephesus. Ephesus is a different kind of town. It's not your intellectual center. It's not your let's go here to have a party time kind of center. Now that again doesn't mean that none of that exists. But Ephesus is sort of your transcendental meditation town. You want to go there, sort of zen through something, and mystery religions and all of that kind of thing. Matter of fact, when Paul talks in Ephesians about Jesus Christ is above all principalities and powers and heavenly places, he's alluding to these images of mystery religion that the people at Ephesus subscribed to. And certainly one of the main elements in the city of Ephesus was this temple to Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, even according to the ancient world's description. What I find interesting is of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, Parthenon's not on the list. And we can know the glory and grandeur of the Parthenon. Certainly we have still surviving the pyramid and part of the tomb of Halicarnassus. But what must the temple of Artemis have looked like in order to be on that list compared with Parthenon not there? The temple to Artemis in Ephesus was 4 times the size of the Parthenon. And that's a pretty impressive structure in and of itself. But here's basically all that remains of it. The Turks have made one lone pillar standing out there as a commemoration of its location. The British, however, excavated the site in the late 1800s. There are still excavations ongoing here, but they excavated the site, and the temple and elements of this can still be located. And here are some of the column drums from the Artemis temple. Give you some idea of the size of these. Not as big as the column bases and drums of the Luxor or anything like that, but still impressive and very ornately decorated. Paul goes here, and this is the scene that's going to serve as a bone of contention. Not so much the temple per se, but images that are associated with it. As Paul is going to be preaching, he's going to have success as people leave their mystery religions. And the Bible will tell us in Acts that the conversions are so great that finally they get to a point where they gather up a lot of their books of incantations and they bring them to town and they burn them, the value of which is 50,000 pieces of silver. Now it's very important, I think, to understand the significance of that. They don't just abandon the religion and sell the books, because that will keep the books and the incantations sort of in circulation. They rather take the books out of circulation and fully destroy them, trying to eliminate the evil influence of this. Now, I'm not an advocate of book burning here. That's not my point. But I think we have to understand the conviction of the people. They did not want to influence others at all to continue in this mystery religion, since they have learned the glory and the wonder of Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God. And so they want to take it out. Well, eventually this is going to create such a stir that Demetrius, who makes these little silver shrines, is going to begin eating into his profits. Too many people are becoming Christians. We're losing our money. And he's going to create a riot. Now, in this picture, we're walking down Careta Street, down Ephesus, and near the foot of this, we're going to encounter the Agora. Along the way, you'll see some of the wealth represented in this mosaic sidewalk. They don't let you walk on it now, all right? But this mosaic sidewalk that exists, and you imagine people walking along, and this is the rich part of town, all right? This is the Beverly Hills of of Ephesus kind of thing. And eventually we come down to that Agora. This would be the area where Demetrius has his shop and is feeling the encroachment of Christianity and its effect as people are ceasing to buy those silver shrines. And he's so upset about this that he finally stirs people up and manages to get them to go down to the theater where they rally, and for 2 hours, great is Artemis of the Ephesians, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Imagine sort of a basketball game, where everybody gets real enthused, and nobody can hear because everybody's shouting so loudly, and after 2 hours, and then the city keeper comes in, and at that point he manages to get them to calm down. He says, if you have any charges against these people, then we have the courts to follow, and so forth and so on. But we are in danger of being threatened by the Roman authorities for this illicit assembly. This is the arena. This is the theater in which that rally to Artemis takes place. The fuss was about this. Now, no silver shrines of this have been found. There's a logical reason for that. Precious metals are very easily melted down and recycled into other things. So to find these kinds of images in silver would probably be really extraordinary. But we do have probable evidence of what these would have looked like in the form of these ceramic types that are available. What I find interesting, Paul works at Ephesus for several years. Now, as we think in terms of the three cities, Athens, an intellectual town, Corinth, a very worldly town, Ephesus, a mysterious religion kind of town, Paul's success is far greater in that world of mystery religion and immorality than it was in the intellectual town. That probably sort of flies in the face of what we normally think in terms of. Let me talk to the intellectual people. Let me talk to the people who are educated. Let me talk to the people who can think through this, and we can be successful there. That was where Paul had the least success. Perhaps it's because the people who are living worldly lives are trying to find something, and they have difficulty locating it. Then when Jesus really comes into their lives and they hear what Jesus is all about, they can see so much differently. Or the mystery religions, which is ultimately a dead end. Jesus actually provides the power and above all of those concepts. I want to suggest that we run a risk in our world today of sort of judging for someone else. Well, no need to talk to this person because he or she wouldn't be interested. Who are we to make those decisions? Our responsibility as children of God is to teach it. Ours is not to decide for them whether they will accept or not. Because a lot of times we'll be totally surprised who is going to accept the gospel message of Jesus Christ. And as I look at Athens and Corinth and Ephesus, I see sort of that surprise and Paul's relative successes in these respective towns. Let's consider that as we go our way. Thank you.